This is where the future begins. It's time to invest in our future. It's time to help our schools improve for the future. And it's time to give our educators what they need to innovate for the future. Because the future of Texas is in our public schools.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas believes in honest conversations like the one you're about to see. For thoughtful insights related to healthcare policy, check out our Blue Promise podcast and videos. Learn more at standingwithtexas.com.
Hi, everybody. I'm Evan Smith, the CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to this morning's virtual event, a conversation with Tom Luce and Margaret Spellings of Texas 2036. Before we begin, a little housekeeping. Today's event is made possible and free to access thanks to the support of AT&T, Walmart, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, and Raise Your Hand Texas. These generous Texas Tribune supporters and other donors and sponsors play no role in determining the content, panelists, or line of questioning at our events. We'll be talking today for about 45 minutes, including your pre-submitted questions. I've got a good batch in hand, and I'm looking forward to asking them on your behalf. If you'd like to tweet about our discussion, please use the hashtag TTEvents. And if you like what you see, join us back here at noon this Monday, June 22nd, when my colleague Abby Livingston, the Tribune's Washington bureau chief, will interview U.S. Representative Veronica Escobar of El Paso. Speaking of future events, don't forget that tickets for the virtual Texas Tribune Festival are on sale now. This morning, we announced another batch of confirmed speakers, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, Senator Marco Rubio, Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang, President Trump's former economic advisor, Gary Cohn, state reps Sarah Davis and Donna Howard, and state senators Carol Alvarado and Larry Taylor. Go to texastribune.org/festival to sign up today. Okay, let's get on with the show. Now it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's guests, Tom Luce, the founder and chairman of Texas 2036, and Margaret Spellings, its president and CEO. The two longtime public servants and public citizens joined forces last year to launch the nonprofit org, which has taken on the task of marshaling data and research in service to the idea that Texas can be the best place to live and do business through its bicentennial and beyond. Today, Texas 2036 unveiled a strategic framework that sets out 36 policy goals, 36, get it, across 7 policy areas that help determine the health and strength of the state's economy and quality of life. We'll talk about that. Of course, the org was founded before the coronavirus and the other once-in-a-generation crises we're grappling with at the moment, so the task before Tom and Margaret and their team has intensified. We'll talk about that too. Tom is a native of Dallas, a graduate of Southern Methodist University and SMU Law School. Once upon a time, he founded and was managing partner of the Hughes and Luce law firm. He's also been Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education, founding president of the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, founding CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative. I could go on. Most recently, his status as everyone's go-to landed him on Governor Abbott's strike force to open Texas. Margaret is a Michigan native and a graduate of the University of Houston. She most recently spent 4 years as the president of the 17-institution University of North Carolina system. In President George W. Bush's second term, she served as the U.S. Secretary of Education, leading the implementation of the accountability-focused No Child Left Behind Act and launching the Commission on the Future of Higher Education. Full disclosure, she's a member of the Texas Tribune's board. We're happy to have them join us. Please join me in welcoming Tom Luce and Margaret Spellings. Welcome to you both. Good to see you.
Thanks, Evan.
Thanks for having us, Evan.
Before we begin, Tom, today is your 80th birthday, or in pandemic years, your 280th birthday.
It feels like that.
Yeah, we're all going to sit back now, and Margaret is going to sing to you. Just kidding.
Okay,
Don't
but I could.
We don't want this event to end prematurely. So, okay. Listen, you guys, we're here to talk about the future. And again, thanks very much for being here. But first, we have to talk about the present. It's quite a world we're living in these days, and I want to ask you about it. Tom, let's start with the economy and public health, two subjects you know well. I mentioned earlier that you're on the governor's strike force. In fact, you're one of 5 people associated with Texas 2036, I believe, on the strike force. Is that right?
That's right.
You know what I'm going to ask. The state's been reopening in stages, and the data on coronavirus cases and hospitalizations and the like is surging. Your own Texas 2036's own COVID tracker tells the tale. All the criteria we were supposed to be meeting as a condition of reopening contain the words downward trajectory. I don't see many or any downward trajectories, Tom, in your data. Did we reopen too soon?
You know, I don't think so for this reason, Evan. And let me say this, the data and our COVID tracker does cause a great deal of concern, and we all need to be cautious. But, you know, it was a balancing act between lives and livelihood. I mean, the economic fallout from this pandemic has been tremendous. And so I feel like we have to reopen. But, you know, we as citizens and public figures have to understand we didn't flatten the curve. We flattened to a plateau. And this coronavirus is going to be with us a good while. Well, we can't shut down the economy for 12 months. People are hurting in the real world. And so it's a balancing act, but it's, you know, we're at a inflection point here, and we have to be very cautious and understand there are some basics, though, that we can do that we're not doing enough of, like masks and like social distancing and not going to crowds.
I mean, you're a data guy. That's your brand. Your brand is I'm a data guy, right? So if I look at the data does not tell me show's over, everybody, everything's fine. The data tells me be concerned. And we have been told by the people in charge, these are the metrics to pay attention to. Don't pay attention to those, pay attention to these. So now we're focused on these, and these are bad, and yet we're still being told, don't pay attention to these. Now just kind of go about your business.
Well, that's not what Texas 2036 is saying. Texas 2036 is saying data, we're putting the data out there and saying, let us show you the rolling averages. Let us show you what's happening, because we want the public informed.
You'll acknowledge that trajectories in that data, they don't make anybody on their face. They don't make anybody particularly confident about where we are with regard to.
It should make us cautious, make us very cautious.
Right.
And it should make us mindful that we need to be careful so that people can be at work, because people are hurting.
Right. Margaret, you've had your hands on the wheel of both public ed and higher ed for many years. Of all the thorny questions we're facing now, and it's a lot of thorny questions, maybe the thorniest is about when and how we put students back in classrooms and on campuses. If you were the Secretary of Education today, or you were running the University of North Carolina today, what would you be thinking and what would you be doing with regard to this?
Well, I think we all have seen a couple of things. One, there's no real functioning or reopening of America without our schools being online and functioning as well. And so we have to figure out a way to do that. Our students need to go back to school in some shape, form, or fashion. And I'm very worried about, learning loss, especially with our disadvantaged students, which will hurt them through their lifetimes if we don't attend to it now. And so I think we have to figure out all the solutions that we need to get regular order happening in our schools. And there are some creative things. There'll be some silver linings in this, but we've got to get back to business, just as Tom has said, in some way.
So let me ask you the same question. Sounds like you've answered it already, but let me ask you the same question I asked Tom. Are we reopening effectively the schools too soon? Do you think it's time to reopen?
Well, schools are not open at the moment, obviously. We've, converted quickly to online, and we learned what we already knew, and that is that there are huge gaps in broadband ubiquity and device proliferation and those sorts of things, teacher capability around online. So we've had a time this summer to pull back and say, holy cow, we better get ready for the new normal in the fall. And educators all over higher ed and K-12 are doing that. And we're seeing a lot of variations on the theme, as you should, because there are districts of all sizes. We're in communities with more or less prevalence and on and on. So we will see a lot of different innovations.
And the fact is, the college campuses that have talked about reopening are doing it with a hybrid model. Some are going to be in-person classes, some are going to have online classes. And again, we'll come to broadband in a while as a measure of our, health as a state. Are we giving adequate access to everybody? But that's a big piece of this, because really, if we're talking about kids being able to do a hybrid model even in the fall, we're going to have to get our broadband house in order to make that happen.
No question about it. And let me just say this, let's all take a gap here. We know that our neediest students, if they drop out, they don't come back. And there is never a bad time to invest in your own self and your own learning and your own development. And that's more true than ever.
Yeah. Tom, you were the architect of Texas 2036. Margaret joined a little later. So let me ask you to tell the origin story. Why this organization and why now? What was the catalyst? This is a theme I'm going to come to again and again today. The problems that you're addressing are not new problems. Many of them have existed unaddressed for years. So why now?
I think it was because I had been in the public arena so long. I saw several things happening. One, what I call the silo effect. That is to say, in Austin, you go down, and there's nothing wrong with silos, but I'd advocated in the K through 12 silo. I'd advocated in the higher education silo, a transportation silo, a mental health silo. But at the end of the day, it all has to fit together. And all these big problems are big systems that need transformation. And it doesn't occur overnight. You can't fix them in one session. Lord knows, Margaret tried in one session. I tried in one session. We all try, and then we declare victory and we go home. And guess what? The system doesn't change. Just the K through 12 system is so gigantic. The higher education system is so gigantic. So you pass one piece of legislation, and guess what? It's not transformed. And we live in a world where people live in those systems, and our healthcare system's not fixed. Our education system's not fixed. It requires long-term thinking. And in today's world, I used to say long-term was next November, but now it's today's tweet. And so you have to have a long-term plan. I tell the story, I've got 7 grandsons. I tell them, if you get on the highway, you better know whether you're going to Oklahoma City or Laredo. I mean, you need to know what your North Star is. What direction are you headed? And you need to know where to get off the exit ramp and the entrance ramp. And so we need a plan, but then we need to fight each battle in each session. And it requires long-term planning. And it requires an organization that will do that.
Yeah. Margaret, to the point of a long-term plan, you all have chosen 7 areas of focus. You call them your policy pillars. They're prosperity and well-being, education and workforce, health, infrastructure, natural resources, justice and safety, and government performance. That is, by definition, a subjective call on your part. Why these 7 and not 7 others? I'm thinking back to when Ross Ramsey and I were involved with the founding of the Texas Tribune. We had to figure out which beats our reporters would cover. We looked at the biggest lines in the state budget, and we said, okay, those are our beats. So why these 7? Did you go through a similar process of saying, what are the 7 top expenditures by the state, or where the 7 areas that affect people the most? How'd you come up with that list of 7?
All of that is true, and they're perennial. I mean, I think we're going to be worried about whether people can read 16 years from now, just as we are today. And so, and the other thing I would say is some of our indicators, like the prosperity and the economic opportunity ones, are places where we can roll up things like the arts or the weather or other dimensions that, might not show up in other places.
Yeah. The strategic framework, which I referenced in the introduction, again, is 36 goals across those 7 pillars. And then you have these indicators, something like 160, right, or more, that help us evaluate Texas's progress toward these goals. Margaret, this is basically the ball game, right? This is the ball game. These indicators tell us what we need to know in those areas about how we're doing.
Exactly. As Tom said, we don't turn the Queen Mary overnight. So we have to, set priorities. First of all, here's the framing. 36 aspirations for our state, for each other, for ourselves. should Texans have clean air and clean water? Should they be educated well enough to access the job market? And then we're going to figure out, well, where are we today? Where do we want to be? And how are we going to monitor our progress over time? So it's pretty simple on its face, but heck, we're the 10th largest economy in the world. And yeah, it's a little bit complicated, but we have at least taken the task of let's put it in a big frame externally and try to build civic demand for this kind of thinking with our policymakers.
So let's just pick a couple of examples. I pulled out two of the goals and then some of the underlying indicators. So an example of a goal and indicator. So the goal is affordability of healthcare, the perennial topic in Texas, right? Especially right now coming out of the coronavirus. Texans able to afford the basic health care they need. That's the articulation of the goal. So the indicators you put in the framework are percentage of adults who report needing to see a doctor in the past year but could not because of cost.
Yes.
Percentage of the population without health insurance and out-of-pocket healthcare spending. Those indicators will be effectively the metrics of success. We'll see how the trends go.
That's right. You got it.
And again, though, those indicators are subjective. Somebody else might have picked other indicators.
Are
people specifically advising you in each of these areas who have deep subject matter expertise? You didn't just pluck these out of the air.
Absolutely. Thanks for the medium speed pitch over the plate. We have had policy advisory groups that have informed this work in and out of government, the state climatologist, the state demographer. Most of our public universities have partnered with us on research. The Texas Transportation Institute at A&M, UT Dallas on a dashboard and data work, and on and on and on. So you bet. We want to be as smart as we possibly can. And we believe this is an open source process with all sorts of Texans involved, experts and general folks.
And the experts who are the inputs to produce these outputs, that is public information. You're transparent about who those people are, and you are trying to avoid, because we've discussed this in the past, I know this is your intent, we're trying to avoid partisanship. People who have an axe to grind or an agenda on one side or the other becoming the inputs and tilting the scale in one direction or another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean,
So
you'll see by virtue of it's a lot, 36 goals. There's a lot that isn't in there. And I don't mean to minimize those issues, but we don't have a goal on guns or abortion or bathrooms or, things like that. We think these are the powerful levers of prosperity over time.
Tom, the fact is Margaret just referred to three issues that have individually over the years been things that have blown up legislative sessions, right? These are issues, they would be the so-called sharp objects on the table. Not that people aren't passionate about them or have a right to be passionate about them, but the fact is those are not the kitchen table issues, the bread and butter issues that get to the future prosperity of the state. So it probably makes sense that you would not consider them in your charge, right?
That's right. And that's the reason why we framed it. We felt these were the most important issues to determine what was your quality of life and your economic prosperity and your well-being of your family, your ability to take care of your family. This is about the basics. This is about the basics of everyday life.
Yeah. So, and some of these, let's be honest, as much of the hard work of government that people don't see, some of these goals are boring goals. They're not important, but they're boring. So here's another goal picked out: mobility. How boring is that? Texans being able to get to their destinations effectively and efficiently. Well, I guess it's not boring if you can't get there, right? But mobility is a goal. So you have a whole bunch of indicators that you list: the annual cost of time lost and fuel spent for passenger car delays, percentage of workers using any mode to access work besides single occupancy vehicles, traffic severity, commute times, vehicleless commuting. There's a whole long list. I mean, really, these things, again, are going to tell us, are we doing a good job on basic transportation or are we not? A problem that has been with us forever. It may be with us forever, but at least now we're going to understand. Right?
Exactly.
Well, and we're going to understand, Evan. I think the important thing is what makes us unique. We're going to understand the interconnectedness of those issues. The fact that if you can't have the right mobility system, you can't get to healthcare. You can't get to the doctor. You can't get to school. You can't get to a well-paying job. So we look at how this all connects As
Right.
Margaret likes to say, our theme song is that old song about, the hip bone's connected to the ankle bone, connected to the, whatever bone. And this is all about interconnectedness. And this is how you break down the silos which impact government policy.
Yeah. Margaret, the measure of success
I
here,
dropped my iPad.
you dropped your AirPods. Yeah, well, that's okay. We can hear you. You can put your AirPods back in. I'll just talk to Margaret for a while.
Hey, he's
Mark,
waiting.
the means to an end here in every one of these instances ultimately is the data that you talked about previously, right? Data is the flashlight. Data tells us, are we succeeding at these things or not? And really, Texas 2036 is, if nothing else, a repository for a vast number of data sets, right? That is one of the things that you make available for free at your website, is massive amounts of data.
Right.
Can I interrupt and say I'm back? My earpod dropped out.
Well,
Okay,
you were really
all
just on, but you sound better. There aren't a lot of 80-year-olds today who were talking about dropping their AirPods, Tom. So you're a pretty hip dude as these things go. Margaret, again, you are basically collecting all these data sets and
Right.
presenting those data sets as the answer to the question of how we're doing.
Exactly. And we have established a goal. We've looked at where we are, how we're doing today. We've set some targets as to how far we think we can and should and must get between now and 2036. And importantly, we've set a bit of a space race. We've set ourselves against a set of peers, 11 other states who represent more than the majority of GDP and the population. And so, we're trying to understand, where are we? And out of that, we start to say, well, what are our priorities? What should we do first? But again, we're looking at it in totality. We can't do it all at once, obviously.
I'm glad you brought up that space race thing. You're benchmarking our success versus that of other states. That's part of the exercise you're going through here. Isn't that a fanciful notion in a state that believes it can do no wrong, has it all figured out, doesn't care what works in other states? Speaking of brands, our brand, we know better, we go our own way. You think that anybody in the Capitol gives a rip about how we are compared to California?
Well, let me say this. We compete with all those other states for talent, for business, for people. When you look at our data, Evan, I think the striking thing I learned out of this whole exercise is how much this state's prosperity the last 10 years was dependent upon domestic and international migration in overwhelming numbers. And the sad news is that migration was better educated than our native population. So we better compare how we compete, because if people stop coming here, if they are attracted to other states, then we're in trouble.
Margaret, let's stop and just say that again. One of the things we've learned over the years as our population has grown, in large measure because of domestic migration to Texas, is that people from other states actually come in better prepared to do the hard work and to realize the possibility of prosperity better than our native Texans are?
Absolutely. And we have a great hand to play.
That's Tom Luce smack talk against Texas, if I don't know any better.
No,
right?
I mean, really. I mean, that's appalling.
But that's where the flashlight is important, because if we don't do a much better job of educating our own people, we're going nowhere fast. And the coin of the realm, the most successful state, the most successful nation will figure out how to close achievement gaps, how to educate everybody to much higher levels. And we're a long way from doing that. And our report card says that we're number 12 against our 12 peers. On early reading, for example. We're glad the legislature acted on House Bill 3. That's, a good start. But we've been going the wrong direction for about a decade, and people ought to know that.
We're in the basement, and that's not just coming from any mundane observer. That's coming from the former U.S. Secretary of Education. You know this stuff. You think that we are in the basement in terms of reading.
Well, we've gone from the mid-30s to the low 40s. Do the math.
Yeah. So again, just so I get this, the idea you're working toward, or that we're working toward, is Texas should be the best place to live and work versus other states. It's not best defined as us versus us. Best the best we've ever been. That is not good enough as far as you're concerned. It has to be the best compared to other states.
That's what we're striving for sure. And of course, we are evaluating ourselves against ourselves, like I just said with reading, where we were higher and now we're lower. That's an internal frame. But we're also losing ground with our competitors. And people ought to know both of those things.
Yeah. Luce, do you think that best versus how we've been in the past? I mean, I sort of think you always want to be on a path of improvement. I suppose if you improve against yourself, you're probably also improving against other states. Not necessarily,
well, Evan,
but
yeah, Evan, the way I talk about it is, look, in football terms, and we love football in Texas. It's one thing to win the national championship one year. Can you repeat year after year after year? And this is about, can we keep climbing the mountain? We like to pat ourselves on the back and say we had the Texas miracle and we led the nation in job growth and all that. But the issue is, will that still be happening for the next generation? Will that be happening 10 years from now? And it won't unless we keep working at it.
I like your football analogy. We don't want to be in a scrimmage against ourselves. We want to be playing other teams, and preferably we want to be playing good teams and beating them. That's the point.
And beating them.
Right.
But listen, I don't want to leave this with a downer, because we would not want to be anywhere but Texas. We're big, we're getting bigger, we're young, we're diverse. We have vast natural resources. We have every asset in the world, and how we play this hand will determine whether Texas is the best place to live.
We can play for the national championship.
The point is, though, we have work to do. And I think one of the things that the future of the state, one might say, reading your framework, is riding on our willingness to be honest about the hard work we have to do. So let me ask the two of you to be honest. Overall, how are we doing? When you aggregate all these goals and all these indicators, as of right now, how are we doing? How would you grade us in terms of the health and strength of our state across these different areas? How are we doing?
I would say our brand and our pride outmatch our performance at the moment. And so we have a very happy narrative. When you look under the hood, we've got a lot of work to do.
We've got some red lights, green lights, and yellow lights.
Tom, why are we not doing better? Here's where I want to hold you guys to the fire and say, name names. Who is to blame for our not doing better? Who's responsible?
We all are. We haven't built civic demand for long-term thinking on these most important things. We've begged for variations of the role of the state and the role of cities and counties. I mean, it's a whole lot of reasons, but we're all to blame. And that's what we're trying to fix. We're trying to educate our fellow Texans, build civic demand, and sign on for aspirations for the future.
Let me ask the question differently, Tom. Is the problem that the public is not asking for changes to make the state better? Or is the problem that the public is asking, but the people we elect to office and put in these high power positions of power aren't listening?
Both. There's not sufficient demand, and the public figures aren't because the public is not sufficiently informed to hold them accountable for specific things that need to be done. I told somebody the other day, I've never met a candidate on either party who is against education. Duh. Okay.
Right.
But what are you going to hold them accountable for? How are you going to assess their performance?
Right. I want to ask you about a couple aspects of this, more of the process side of the house here. There's a quote in your framework that I jumped out at me. We believe that policy solutions work best when state and local governments are pulling in the same direction, when top down meets bottom up. We believe in facts over ideology, action over accusations, solutions over stalemates. What fantasy world are you living in?
We're going to change the world, Evan.
What about the political environment? Luce, what about the political environment we're in makes you think we can get on the same page about this stuff? We can't even agree on masks. Come on.
But we have done it in the past. In the 80s, I saw a coalition of African-American, Hispanics, the business community. I saw the first education reform bill pass unanimously in the Senate and with 3 negative votes in the House. It can be done. We've done it before. Margaret did it in Washington, D.C., for God's sakes, with a bipartisan coalition of Ted Kennedy and John Boehner on the Republican side. Of course it can be done.
And this is where it tells me about, you remember George W. Bush when he was governor, Margaret. You're going to now tell me about when he was hugging and kissing on Bob Bullock, right?
No, that's true too. But I'm going to tell you that elected officials respond to the public. Look what we are seeing around race. I mean, 2 years ago, it wouldn't have been, people were up in arms about even saying Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, all this stuff. Now you drive around your neighborhood and there are yard signs that say Black Lives Matter. Yes, they do. And so I believe that the policymakers can and do respond, and that our electoral system can work as when people are engaged and educated.
So if the system is broken and we can't get on the same page, we need new people and a new page. That's pretty much it, right?
Yeah. But let me say this: in a democracy, you get what you deserve, and we need to demand more.
Yeah. The other thing that occurred to me, two more things occurred to me. One is, this sounds expensive. What you're talking about here, the work that has to get done between now and 2036, sounds expensive. Texas is, again, speaking of brands, we keep coming back to the brand of Texas, is not a very spendy state. This state loves the fact that it is conservative fiscally, does not want to spend a lot of money. That would be a problem for your well-intentioned efforts at any time, but we are going to walk into a flaming bag of a session next January, where the revenue estimate will have already been revised down, presumably, and where the amount of money we have to spend is going to be significantly less than we'd like. How do you afford the work that needs to be done? This is not without cost, what you're proposing.
That makes our work even more important. You know, Evan, the one fundamental issue that every legislative session decides is how do you allocate scarce resources? And we're going to have $250 billion that we have to decide how to allocate. And how are we going to spend that the best way to education, health, and everything's going to have to be on the table. Everything on the revenue side, everything on the expense side, and how you spend that money is going to be critical. And we'll have a plan as to how you spend that money.
So a couple things to add to that. We've got to make sure we got to make sure we spend the federal money that we have gotten wisely and well, and with some transparency around it. That will keep us from having to fill those holes with state resources when we come to Austin in January. And I think, our theory of action overall is we can be a state that is attractive to business, that is no income tax, when we educate people and we get a flywheel going of people who are better prepared, accessing the workforce, and contributing to their communities. It's, it will be a virtuous cycle. And I believe we can do that.
Of course, I hear Tom talking about $250 billion to spend. That's what we spent in the last session. I think it'd be a miracle if we had as much next session as last session, but we'll see.
Totally agree. But
it may very well be a session of hard choices. I mean, that's kind of the point. Spend money on less.
But let me say this. There's never enough resources, Evan. There's never enough resources. So the fundamental question that the Texas Tribune is always, how do you allocate the resources you do have to get the most bang for the buck? Right. And we have to have a plan for that.
So my third observation in reading your framework is the cynic in me wants to say, this is a nice civics lesson. But if these things could be fixed, they would have been fixed already. There are political reasons why much of this work has not been done in the past and doesn't get done now. Either it's because they're non-starters politically. You end up, people thinking about their primaries and they can't come out and do what is arguably right for the state, even if it's wrong for their campaigns, or special interests. The lobby and other interested parties thwart pure hearts and good intentions. How do you
That's why we have to mobilize the middle. That's why we have to mobilize the middle. You know as well as I do that we have a disengaged public to the political process because neither party is speaking to the things that impact their day-to-day life.
And well, I think that's less true today than it was 3 months ago. And the silver lining of COVID and George Floyd is for people to say, holy cow, We better attend to this stuff, and it will allow our policymakers, I think, to, think again, to pivot to whatever word you want to use, using data, using this moment, using the public demand for change to make important changes we need.
On the subject of COVID, before we go in a couple of minutes.
Hey, by the way, Evan,
yes.
In 1982, you told me there was zero chance House Bill 72 would pass.
Right. Well, look, the reality is that you always think the things that are impossible until they're possible, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
right.
You don't know. But I think to Margaret's point, the table has been reset over the last 3 months.
Absolutely.
And conversation, one of the only silver linings coming out of this may very well be that we're going to have opportunities that we would not have had before. And I want to come back here at the end to what we talked about at the very beginning, and that is that you started Texas 2036 pre-coronavirus, pre-economic collapse, pre-reckoning on race. Margaret, what does this cascade of crises do to your action plan? Does it cause you to reorder your goals? We talked about broadband already. One of the things we've discovered in the middle of this pandemic is that the broadband gap is really a thing from an education and an economic development and a healthcare standpoint in a lot of communities around the state, poor, non-white. I mean, there's just all kinds of places where that's the case. And maybe you need to elevate that to the top of the agenda.
I think that's exactly right. So this is surfaced priorities. It's surfaced the what do we do first steps. And that's one of them. We will have a mighty coalition of K-12, higher ed, health, economic development around that issue. Heck, we've been talking about this broadband stuff for 30 years. Let's get after it. Let's understand the financial limitations and the boulders in the way and get it done. Clearly, workforce with millions of unemployed Texas, that'll be surfacing. And we need to get organized for success, as I like to say, in our higher ed and K-12 and community college systems, health and public health. And then we've got to make the government work better. And this government performance stuff that we talk about people and data and management systems, we need all that too.
Okay, let's go to some audience questions in the remaining 10 minutes, if you don't mind. Here's one that came in yesterday about the two of you and about your leadership of this organization. The assumptions you're making about the future of Texas are assumptions about a state that will look very different from the one we're living in today and will look very different than the two of you. Do you worry that your approach to doing this important work isn't sufficiently taking into consideration the demographic drivers of change? Do you worry there are blind spots to the assumptions you're making or to the data you're collecting, given the fact that you are, with due respect, older, whiter, and more conservative than the state is apt to be in 16 years?
Well, some of us are less old than others. Let me respond to that. That is why we have worked hard to build a board that is diverse in every way. That's why, as part of our product here, we have our aggregating through lines of all things equity, all things rural, all things children, so we can surface those things and slap people in the face with the facts around those. And we will continue to do that. That is our mission, is to build a mighty force of all Texans, of every color, every generation, and get after these aspirations we have for ourselves.
And
Tom, do you
every time I've talked about this from the beginning, I've said this has to be a relay race. Yes, this old generation may have had the original vision, but this is like the 440 relay. We have to hand off the baton to the next generation and the next generation. This is about the next generation, not my generation. I can break the finish line okay. Now, I won't break the tape hard, but I can break the tape.
It'll be broken. Maybe you'll just bring scissors, right? That's how that'll get broken. Another audience question. Sometimes this is from Suzanne. Sometimes people want to do something but have a hard time knowing what, when, and how. What are things that ordinary Texans can do to participate and support a dynamic and thriving future? So what we know the work you all are doing. What can the rest of us do in support of the idea that we want a good future?
I would tell Suzanne and everybody to get smart about your community, get on our database, Find out how your community is doing on education and health and infrastructure and water and air and on and on. Sign on to, look at our aspirations, endorse them. And if you don't endorse them, tell us what we're missing or what should change. I mean, get smart about where we are and where we need to be, starting with your local community.
Okay. Tom, let me ask this question to you from Elizabeth. I live on a ranch an hour northwest of Austin, an area that is rapidly becoming suburban. The original ranchers surrounding us have their large properties for sale and developers are interested. Is a plan for preserving open spaces part of your work at Texas 2036? How do you think about that particular issue as it relates to the future of Texas?
We do, and we look very much at parks, open spaces. I mean, how we think about that's why it's important, by the way, to have a long-term plan, because as we expand, as we grow, and by the way, we need to grow, but we need to take into account, if we are 40 million people in 2036, where will the open space be? Where will the green space be? Where will the parks be? So the answer is absolutely.
Okay. Margaret, this one is tailor-made for you from Bill. Why is support for accountability in education, both higher ed and K-12, almost non-existent among the elected class? You want to talk about a medium pitch over the plate. This is like EFIS pitch over the plate for you.
Where do I begin? The therapy session, the catharsis. Oh my gosh. That's a great question, because it is, the reason that we, in my humble estimation, went from the mid-30s to the low 40s is because we stopped caring enough about our poor and minority students and the achievement gap in our accountability systems. And, what gets measured gets done, folks. That's why Ted Kennedy and George Bush joined forces around it, because it is a major civil rights issue. And so I think it got uncomfortable for people on both sides of the aisle. So these weird coalitions between the unions and what I'll call the Federalist Republicans on one side, and the civil rights community and the business community on the other. And so ascendant, the anti-accountability troops at the moment. But, I think people are starting to pay attention. And again, back to the data. What do the facts tell us?
Well, Margaret, but we were talking about this yesterday offline from this conversation. You know that the big driver for the decision to reduce the number of standardized tests in the state of Texas a number of sessions ago were regular folks. It was moms. It was people in communities all over the state who effectively marched up Congress Avenue with pitchforks and the legislature listened. That's theoretically how this is supposed to work. The public spoke.
Right.
What's wrong with?
Well, I think, when I reflect back on that, and I was somewhere else at the time, but, we killed the goose that laid the golden egg, and we had kind of overdone it on accountability. If, 10 tests were good, 25 were better. And so I think, again, back to COVID, this technological era will allow us to embed assessment in real time, get information to teachers quicker. So there were a lot of things about kind of implementation of accountability that were flawed. But, caring enough to find out how every student does is, essential.
You are still
and
close.
Evan, can I use that as an example? I think this is what we're trying to overcome. That became a political argument that was basically the extremes of both sides. Throw it all out or keep it all.
Right.
Well, this is really what Texas 2036 is about. How do we do assessment better?
Yeah.
That could have been the argument.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
we certainly live in the United States of overcorrection. We decide we love something,
Sure.
and then we go too far, and then we pendulum swings all the way back. Now we hate it, right?
Correct.
And there you have.
I mean, this
Right,
is about
crazy.
how
All
do
right,
you
so,
swing the pendulum.
Luce, here's a question for you. From Susan. Texas 2036 data shows that Texas healthcare costs are increasing at an unsustainable rate. At the same time, Texas has the highest uninsured rate in the country. Did pre-COVID. Now, of course, it's going to be even higher post-COVID. The major lever our state has to address this critical issue is leveraging available federal dollars by expanding Medicaid. But we've been unwilling to do it. What are the practical policy tools our state has to address the crisis in healthcare and the cost of healthcare? And I'm going to make you tell us, Tom, whether you think, the conventional wisdom at the conservative elected class level notwithstanding, should we have expanded Medicaid in Texas?
Well, should's irrelevant now.
That's an easy way to get out of answer. Come on.
Wait a minute. You're going back to the blame game. let's look forward. Looking forward, we have to expand access to health care, and that means maximizing federal dollars. We have to figure out a Texas plan that can assure that there is more access to primary care physicians, to the necessities of healthcare. And if that requires taking more federal funds, I'm all for it. Let's figure out how to do it.
So you're not advocating for expanding Medicaid now.
Well, I want it on the table. I want to figure out what are the objections of the right, what are the objections of the left. But let me say one thing real clearly. Just having insurance, whether it's Medicaid, Medicare, or private insurance, doesn't solve the access and affordability to health care. There are lots of people who have private insurance who cannot afford their copay. So you have to attack the whole healthcare system. Right. How do we make expansion of healthcare affordable for everybody? That's the issue, Evan, and we'll tackle it.
Yeah. This is such a great conversation to be having, and I wish it could go on a whole lot longer, but unfortunately we're out of time. Maybe we'll come back on your 81st birthday, Luce, and we'll talk about this stuff again.
Or my birthday.
I really appreciate the two of you. That is our time, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks sincerely to Tom and to Margaret for joining us. And I want to thank our sponsors again for supporting today's event. If you would like to support events like this one in the future, you can become a Texas Tribune member and make our public service journalism happen. Please go to texastribune.org/give. Remember to buy Texas Tribune Festival tickets. Our friends will look forward to seeing you in September. For now, stay safe and stay healthy. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan.